Okay, good afternoon. Welcome to the second Global Health Center World Health Assembly side event in our series. This is the Is Space Closing for Civil Society and Global Health panel discussion. And I'm Meg Davis at the Global Health Center of the Graduate Institute. And we're here with a group of experts, civil society leaders and journalists to talk about a topic that actually came up last year in our discussions with our colleagues at STOPAIDS and Medicus Mundi International, which is really these challenges that NGOs and journalists are facing increasingly in doing their work. And the topic has taken on a new significance in the COVID-19 crisis. So with me today are Gargya Telakapali, Research Associate for the People's Health Movement, Dr. Mercy Courier, medical doctor and a journalist from KTN News in Kenya, Mike Podmore, Executive Director of STOPAIDS and Chair of Action for Global Health, Nadezhda Dermenjeva, Executive Director of the Bulgarian Fund for Women, and Thomas Schwartz, Executive Secretary of Medicus Mundi International. Just to set the stage, I'm going to start by talking a little bit about what it is we're here to discuss today with all of you. And these are fundamental human rights issues that especially affect the work of civil society organizations and journalists. There are a number of human rights, of course, that relate to health, including, of course, the right to the highest attainable standard of health. Today, we're focusing a little bit more on civil and political rights, rights that are guaranteed in the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights, such as the right to freedom of assembly, the right to gather in public, in groups, something some of us still remember doing, the right to freedom of association, to form organizations and register them, have staff, open bank accounts, freedom of expression, the right to express an opinion, investigate, be a watchdog, advocate for change, and the right to participation, which is articulated in a number of different standards, human rights standards, but is especially complex because we'll touch on this a bit today. It gets to more than just tokenistic participation, but really ensuring that there's legitimate representation. The people participating are representing a larger constituency, how they participate, what the process is, how they're included. And underlying all of these rights are fundamental human rights principles of transparency, accountability, and non-discrimination. But increasingly, and now I'm speaking before COVID-19, we were seeing some worrying trends in many countries. Growing number of countries imposing new regulations and new practices that create something we're thinking of as closing civic space. Chips that are reducing our rights being chipped away in a growing number of countries. Attacks on journalists, attacks on media outlets. Over 250 journalists are now in prison globally, 150 in China alone. Imprisonment, digital surveillance, harassment of journalists. And in China, we saw during the early stages of the COVID-19 outbreak in Wuhan, the disappearance of citizen journalists such as Chen Qiushi and others who were drawing attention to the outbreak. A growing number of countries creating new restrictive bureaucratic processes, heavy reporting requirements, requiring government approval, sometimes even government supervision of non-governmental organizations. In Russia, of course, the famous foreign agent laws in which individuals, news organizations, and civil society groups that received funding from abroad are being forced to label themselves as foreign agents, having a chilling effect on their work. Similar laws have now been adopted in numerous other countries. And we're seeing something that the Committee to Protect Journalists calls technology capture, to stifle dissent, surveillance of critics online, shutting down websites, trolls who shout down critics on social media, again, gradually chipping away at our fundamental rights. As well as, and we'll hear some more about this today, targeted attacks on specific groups, human rights organizations, anti-corruption groups, in Europe, groups working on refugees and migrants, many countries, women's rights groups, LGBTIQ groups, and others facing specific attacks. So things were bad enough in 2019, but with the advent of the COVID-19 pandemic, this is a very interesting tracker from the International Center for Nonprofit Law, which has been tracking laws and policies related to COVID-19. And we're seeing, of course, sweeping new powers in many states, allegedly temporary. It's not clear yet how temporary they really will be. some that are following public health guidance, restrictions on freedom of assembly, of course, no crowds gathering, restrictions on our individual movement, shutting down of schools and universities, but also, worryingly, expansion of surveillance, expanded powers to the police and to the military. In Egypt, the military have expanded powers to conduct investigations. More detentions of journalists in many more countries. In India, we saw a case of journalists being beaten by police when they were reporting on COVID-related lockdowns. New laws to punish quote-unquote fake news in Hungary, Cambodia, and elsewhere. Turkmenistan, limits on the word coronavirus. So all of this raises questions for the traditional work that's emerged for civil society and global health. And here I have from the STOPAIDS and others report on civil society and global health architecture, a listing of the current seats that civil society representatives have on the boards or governance agencies of different global health agencies. The World Health Organization, we'll hear more today about the very complicated role that civil society has, the lack of engagement and reforms that have been somewhat controversial, and questions now being raised about who will govern the COVID-19 response. We just launched this worldwide pledging marathon, over 7 billion for diagnostics, treatment, and vaccines. Will this be transparent? Will civil society be at the table? Will journalists be able to investigate? So all of this, a lot to talk about today. So very pleased to have this fantastic group of experts with us. And I'm going to now just open the floor with our discussion to say, okay, so we have here a pretty bleak picture. Human rights people are never the most cheerful people to have around. We're always telling you the bad news. But for a long time, it seemed as if non-governmental organizations, journalists covering health were a little bit protected. There was a safer space for that work, immune to closing civic space, because health was seen as being non-political. Is that true? And Dr. Mercy, I'm going to ask you to speak to this first, if you would. Thanks. I think you are still muted. Maybe we will let you see if you can unmute. Maybe Gargeya, could you speak to this issue? And we'll come back to Dr. Mercy in a moment. Thanks.
Sure. Thanks, Mike. So something that we actually see here is it's not really new that there is an attack. I wouldn't say attack exactly, but a kind of pushback towards organizations which ask the difficult questions. So, I mean, in particular, I mean, until you are doing very simplistic stuff like, health education and, distribution of, you're participating in distribution of meals. I mean, that's kind of a safe space where you wouldn't be getting any feedback or brickbacks from the, but once you start asking questions which are a bit difficult, and maybe you kind of go into the parts about human rights and why the lockdown isn't unplanned. I mean, why is the lockdown unplanned, and how it is affecting, the vulnerable in the society and so on, then starts the kind of situation where the comfortable issues of health actually start becoming uncomfortable. And I think this we are seeing in India, where many NGOs, I mean, from the past, luckily, the People's Health Movement in India and many organizations have been raising issues. For example, we have been raising issues right from, internet shutdowns, the issues in Kashmir, issues of migrants, and in particular, also we have been raising issues about communal riots, the kind of targeting that has been happening over Muslims and so on. So once you go into these difficult questions, it is then that you see a kind of pushback. I think that's something that we all accept. So even, for example, even now, I don't think, I mean, we see many workers' associations, trade unions, actually on an everyday basis asking about, non-availability of PPEs. So when we see this, that's not exactly a very progressive or great response from the government. For example, from the state where I belong, just yesterday, actually, just last week, actually, we saw a doctor being fired from his job because he went on to and spoke to the media that the PPE kits were not available. So until you're in that safe space, it's fine. But once you go beyond that, you start facing a lot of troubles.
All right, thank you. So it has a lot to do with the issues you're raising then that are more sensitive, perhaps.
Exactly.
Okay, great, thank you.
For example,
Dr. Mercy, oh, sorry, go ahead.
please go ahead.
Okay, thanks. Dr. Mercy, can we hear you? No, unfortunately, the microphone doesn't seem to be working. I'm going to suggest maybe that you disconnect and reconnect, because maybe there's a connection issue, and we will come back to you. Oh, there you are.
Okay, all right.
Great, okay, good.
Good.
Please,
So
you have the floor.
I think health has been political in a way, partly political, partly non-political. And non-political is when, as journalists, we are reporting, let's say, about a disease process or a treatment process, then people see that as safe. But when you start reporting about funds, budget allocations towards health, any misappropriation of funds, then at that point you find that you have actually stepped on some toes. And with this COVID-19 pandemic, for example, we are seeing that there's lots of funding, lots of budgets being repurposed for the COVID response, and there's a lot of, there's more scrutiny, there's more eyes on what governments, for example, are spending on COVID-19. Is it value for money? Is it the right thing to do that? So when journalists step into that arena, you find that now the governance class, the leadership class, the political class feel like that is a bit unsettling. In Kenya, the other day, we saw that our Ministry of Health did a presentation of the budget that they spent so far, or they were planning to spend, according to them, on the COVID response. And when we raised some issues, for example, I think the most glaring that most Kenyans raised was that they had allocated, or they had said they'd spent 4 million shillings, which is about, that should translate to 40,000 US dollars on tea and snacks for the duration of 1 month's time, in which they were, having meetings and on the COVID response. So when people raised issues about that, then the principal secretary, the accounting officer for the Ministry of Health, then was like, no. Here is the proper report of what I was going to present. The other money we have not used, we have just allocated. It doesn't mean we've used. And there was lots of glaring mistakes. So we find that when you're talking about money, when you're talking about budgetary allocations, then it stops being political. It stops being non-political and becomes very political. And there's a lot of, attention even on the journalists that are reporting this at that time. But when you're talking on the other scientific things, then people tend to, not even pay much attention to you. So what we are seeing in the COVID-19 is that it's giving us a chance to bring out a lot of the issues that we are not able to bring out before on health space, because we are seeing that now we're even able to have health headlines making front pages of the newspapers, not just in Kenya, but even if you look at regionally, globally, health is actually top of the agenda right now. And now there's more scrutiny, and the people who would not be doing well by health are feeling a bit unsettled, because civil society is out there looking, journalists are out there looking. And so now we are moving more towards a political conversation on health space, which I think is good, because at the end of the day, you need a political will if you are to drive some agenda and some changes in the health space.
Thank you for sharing that. And I'm just curious, before I turn to Nadezhda to hear her experience, what does it look like when journalists get more attention? I mean, what is that experience like?
Fortunately, in Kenya, we have a little bit more freedom of media. The media space is a bit free compared to our colleagues in the region, like Tanzania, for example. So we are able to interrogate these issues. We are able to bring them out. Government will feel unsettled, whether you've highlighted in your stories will feel uncomfortable, but at the end of the day, at least we are enjoying some freedom of expression, freedom of media, freedom to write stories, as long as they are factual and there is evidence to it. We find that there'll be a lot of noise, but then if it is journalistically done well, then there's no much repercussion on the journalist. And that's, I think, what we are seeing here in the country, unlike our colleagues in Tanzania who now have to speak according to what the government has said. They do not interrogate much because we've seen as late as today, there are some 2 Kenyan journalists who are arrested in Tanzania. They've been fined about $460 or face a jail term of, I think, 3 years, because the government in Tanzania said they sneaked into the country to do coverage illegally. So in Kenya, we find that at least we're having a bit of space. Obviously, there are things that go wrong here and there, like when we started a curfew in the whole country, we had journalists who were beaten up by police when they were going about their duties. But if I compare what we are going through in Kenya versus our colleagues in the region, then I would say we are doing much, much better. And we are able to interrogate these issues, publish these issues without fear of dire consequences from the government.
Great, thank you. And I know you spent some time looking into the experiences in other countries in the region, so I hope we can come back to that because I think that would be very interesting to compare. Great, so Nadezhda, can you tell us a little bit about what has been happening in Bulgaria? Because it sounds like it's been a lot tougher there.
Yeah, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, very well.
Thank you, Meg. I think when space is closing for civil society, it is closing for everyone, for all NGOs. It just depends in which sphere you work. So that this closing of space looks really different for women's rights organizations, for example, or for organizations that work on health. So to give an example, a closing space for women's or LGBT rights organizations looks like direct attacks on activists or on our organizations, direct threats, while some other organizations who are not so visibly or at the forefront of the human rights fight, for them the closing of civil society looks like very refined state repression in terms of bureaucracy or in terms of introducing new legislation, forbidding receiving foreign donations. So I wouldn't say that health organizations were treated in a better way or not threatened at all. Specifically for Bulgaria, my country, and I speak as a Bulgarian and as an Eastern European, and even as a post-Soviet person, this closing of civil space, I think it became very visible in 2018. And it's worsened now with the COVID crisis. And we can see this in Hungary, in Poland, and in Bulgaria, because some governments seized opportunities to grab even more power, while we, the NGOs or the activists, were in lockdown and couldn't protest. So this will affect all the civil society sector in the long run. And just a second point, when we talk about health and access to health or even quality health services, of course, it's a fundamental human right. And as such, I would say it's not only a highly political topic, but it's a very intersectional issue. Because there are different groups of people, some of them more vulnerable, who need different types of health services. And in the current situation, it's very visible how women have problems with sexual and reproductive health and rights and accessing those types of services, or LGBT people who have problems with transgender procedures. So this has been going on in the past 2 or 3 years, but now the COVID crisis worsened the situation. So again, women's rights are very interconnected to health rights. And for both, civil space is closing.
Thanks, Nadezhda. That's very concerning. You mentioned direct attacks and threats on your organization. Can you share a bit more about that?
Sure, yeah. So my organization was very outspoken about the ratification of the Istanbul Convention. This is a very fundamental convention of the Council of Europe for elimination of gender-based violence. And with the rise of religious fundamentalism, the far right and fake news in Eastern Europe, there was formation of this anti-gender movement, which is against achieving gender equality, against women's rights. There is a huge backlash. So we were very outspoken. So of course we were the first to be attacked. And by attacked, I mean not only receiving threats, but people literally trying to break into our office. Also, one of our grantees, because we are a grant-making organization as a women's fund, an LGBT center was attacked 3 times for 1 month.
Wow.
But again, this is the most visible part of closing of space for civil society. Restrictions and state repression is much worse in the long run, I would say. And it will worsen now, not only with the COVID crisis, but with the coming economic and political crisis.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Well, that creates huge challenges for your work.
Yeah, it does.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing it. I wanted to kind of zoom out a little bit to if there is such a thing as global health. Some people say it doesn't really exist, that all health is local. But I'm just kind of curious if we start to think from the perspective of global health agencies, what's the current role of civil society in those agencies, and are we seeing any effects from this kind of chill? Mike, I'm going to pass the floor to you to give us that big picture.
Thanks, Meg. I mean, I think you gave, showing the representation of civil society in the current sort of different global health institutions, and it's a very varied picture. I thought maybe I'll limit my comments to sort of talk in a more general way from sort of concept and principle. So firstly, irrespective of the particular skills and perspectives that civil society might bring to global health governance, I think we just have to start by saying that we must recognize the right of civil society to be at the governance table. Governance is only really effective if it meaningfully includes and takes account of the perspectives of all those that are both affected by, but also have a significant effect on the goal of the institution in question. So I think one of the most important roles of civil society in global health governance is one of meaningful representation of those who are the target beneficiaries of the institution, fulfilling the mantra of nothing about us without us. Ensuring that policies and strategies keep their perspectives and needs at the very center. One example being, of course, the communities delegations, both UNITAID and Global Fund, where people living with HIV, TB and malaria are at the table. It is also critical that you have local, national and international civil society organizations from all around the world represented, who play a key role in delivering services, mobilizing populations to access services, awareness raising, and crucially holding duty bearers to account through monitoring and advocacy. So all of these groups are essential for creating a feedback loop, of course, from the ground to the decision makers and governance mechanisms, highlighting issues like stockouts of commodities or unavailability of services, human rights barriers, gender inequality, and whether services are of sufficient quality. So all of this means that it's really just insufficient to just consult with civil society outside of governance structures, as many institutions do, including the WHO, but not only them, including others. So, from our perspective, and you cited our paper, we've been calling for there needs to be a permanent role with voting power for key civil society constituencies within governance structures. And why is that critical? I will just give you a couple of reasons. Firstly, it vests civil society representatives with the ability to observe and influence decisions over time as the institution evolves, rather than only being able to inform discussions when the institution decides that they want to consult us or not. Secondly, it allows civil society representatives to conduct long-term planning and advocacy and develop and strengthen their abilities to navigate and understand and influence the governance bodies from the inside. And thirdly, of course, it also sets an expectation between the representatives of civil society on the boards and the communities they represent, because they're very clearly seen to be there. But it also allows civil society to develop stronger relationships with and respect between different board colleagues. It changes the whole dynamic when you've got governments sitting next to civil society and actually being treated as colleagues rather than a pesky mosquito in their ear buzzing away about some issue or other. And crucially, I think, by having a seat at the table, it allows you, if necessary, to block very controversial policies or to forge compromise that actually allows all different, a range of perspectives to be brought together, and ultimately leading to solutions that everyone has inputted into, but also that they feel bought into to some degree, and ultimately it leads to better decision making. Underpinning all of this, and it's essential, this is only possible if you provide the resources necessary for civil society to perform this role. But maybe I'll stop there and hand over to others.
Thanks, Mike. I mean, I think it's really interesting that you're able to speak to this point, both as someone leading a civil society network, but also as a member of the board of the Global Fund, and having exercised a vote, been on standing committees and so forth. And I'm curious, Thomas, do you want to come in on this point from your experience with WHA and other agencies? What's your take?
Yes, thanks. I think I first want to distinguish between global health initiatives and multilateral institutions, because there is a difference, and we cannot avoid to look at this difference in detail. There is a great number and variety of global health initiatives and partnerships of all kinds, and some of them are really delivering, and some of them are also extremely powerful, in particularly all those big money distribution machines such as the Global Fund, UNITAID, or the Global Financing Facility. And all those partnerships, they have different mechanisms and capacities, and also different track records of working with communities and with civil society. But we need to take care. Those global health initiatives are per se not democratic. They are often organized as clubs with a strong dominance by those powerful actors and funders to whom they are accountable to. And this is not the public. And with their financial power as main legitimacy. And we also have to say that the rise of all those partnerships is interrelated with sidelining, intentionally weakening also and crowding out multilateral institutions such as the WHO. The good news for civil society is, in fact, and Mike stated it, that as most of those partnerships follow what we call a multi-stakeholder approach, and part of this multi-stakeholderism, rules of the games is that all parties are on board, so they also need to have civil society in their governance. They need civil society for their proper legitimacy. So this gives civil society quite a strong position also to claim rights and spaces in those institutions. I am not an expert in the governance of those global health initiatives. There is good academic reporting, also some papers on it, and there are civil society organizations who are also watching what's going on in the governance of particular global health initiatives, such as the Global Financing Facility. So when I talk about democratic global health governance, I mainly also talk about multilateral institutions in the UN system. And here, certainly, we need to focus on the World Health Organization as the directing and coordinating body in international health. And when we as civil society organizations, when I as Medicus Mundi International engage in the WHO and with the WHO, it's also to support all efforts to reconfirm and strengthen the role of WHO as the global health authority. And this is where we suffer, because despite of some very nice partnership rhetoric we have, we don't see civil society fully invited to engage with WHO. And this at all levels, also at the Secretariat, but also at the member states. So those of us who care for the WHO are in a way torn between requesting better access for civil society to those normative and political processes, and at the same time defending WHO and its constitutional mandate as the democratic people's health institution, against being sidelined and against being undermined in its work by powerful commercial and political actors. And sometimes we hesitate ourselves and we ask, what kind of multilateralism are we defending? And how to deal, for example, with the uncontested participation of authoritarian regimes in the WHO, and with WHO engaging itself in all kinds of partnerships with the private sector and reducing further the space of civil society. And it's a bit difficult for us to get organized. Governance of global health organizations is not so sexy as a topic. So we struggle with the essentials.
We're doing our best, Thomas.
No, but we struggle with the essentials of also getting a team, of analyzing what's going on, we do this with workshops, with critical papers, and we have recently set up the Geneva Global Health Hub as a format to allow civil society organizations engaged in this field of learning from each other, discussing things, and trying to strengthen the voice of civil society also in the WHO. Thank you.
Thanks, and I think you've raised really important questions about the proximity to power, right? Without pitting the one agency against another, because I think that's probably a topic for another webinar, maybe we'll have one. But just thinking about what happens when you get close to power, how does that potentially constrain what you say? Are organizations, for instance, the larger international NGOs or even national NGOs that get a lot of funding from global health mechanisms, then constrained in terms of what they can raise? But I see, Gargi, that you were interested to come in on this point. Did you want to jump in?
Yeah, it's a quick comment actually. Mm-hmm. Thanks to Mike and Thomas for bringing this in. So in PHM, we kind of have this joke that we don't use the word stakeholder because, we sometimes feel that, I mean, it's definitely important to be at the table, but that happens to be quite momentary. It only lasts for the time of that 1 or 2 hours of that meeting, and the poor farmer or the laborer or migrant or any the vulnerable person actually goes back to the same back to the same situation. So we kind of momentarily feel that, oh, I brought everyone to the table, so I have done something. I mean, it's a good thing, but there is a lot of limitation there. And the next thing, something that I just wanted to bring in is this difference between the INGOs and the, very local small organizations we see is, for example, I have not seen a big INGO actually come out with a very good statement on the thing that lockdowns has been as harsh as the virus itself. So, I mean, it's general. It's anytime this happens, let it be about Islamophobia, let it be about many things, we actually don't see INGOs and the big organizations that come in from somewhere else, talking these political things, and mostly we see very small organizations which actually have very little to lose when they speak out. So somewhere this is the kind of issue that we keep seeing. And we usually wonder, all the right words are there, but when something really goes wrong, we actually have the local organizations which really don't worry about anything, go ahead and make statements, protests, and so on. So, we see that this safe space, some of the organizations do work in. Yeah, I think I just wanted to make that point. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's a really important point. In terms of who feels able to speak in the marginalization issues, I just want to see if there's anyone else who wants to come in on this, or Mike, if you wanted to come back and respond. Yeah, you're on mute. Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of your broader question, yeah, and who's sort of participating in global health governance and the ability to actually be critical. Yeah, I think it's always a danger that those with the most money and connections have the most influence in global health agencies, irrespective of you know, what the governance mechanisms are and whether you're at the table or not. The only way, I believe the only way that you limit that is by ensuring that you adhere to clear principles of whose voices need to be heard and taken into account in governance and decision making. For example, if you only have governments represented in global health governance, it's no surprise that those closest to governments often have more influence. This means that civil society or private sector organizations that rely on government funding and therefore align themselves fully with government priorities are less likely to be critical. Critical voices are often marginalized or ignored because they can be. The WHA, I think, was sort of a pretty prime example of that this week. In governance mechanisms where civil society has a formal seat and a vote, I think the dynamics do start to change. They're not without challenge by any stretch. I think by clearly demarking a typology of civil society, you can better ensure that the right types of voices start to be heard. As I mentioned, you know, communities delegation. So you have people affected by the health issue at stake. You have perhaps northern NGOs who have, you know, closer connection to some of the donors and can play a role there in influencing them. But then also sort of southern or implementing country NGOs in the context of the Global Fund, where, you know, crucially, they are bringing much more of the national perspective of what it means in terms of implementing services, etc., and what's not happening. When you look at, for example, the delegation that I was involved in as board member, the developed country NGO delegation of the Global Fund board, you might expect that there might be sort of quite a few Beltway bandits, very large, just only very large NGOs. No doubt there were some large INGOs, and actually having their voice was really helpful in terms of understanding some of what they were finding in terms of programs. But actually, in large part, they were led by mostly very critical advocacy NGOs based in non-implementing countries. So the formal sort of nature of these seats means that there is some level of accountability and representation. As I mentioned before, you know, it's by no means perfect, in large part because of sort of lack of resources, but it does mean that there is some sort of expected representation and consultation that needs to happen. And, you know, an identified person that people feel that they can channel issues that are happening at local or national level up to. There's no doubt that from my experience of being on the board, that you have to develop relationships with other stakeholders. And in order to be effective, you have to form understandings of other perspectives. You have to form alliances, and ultimately, in order to pass you know, policies, you have to find often compromise. One of the most interesting aspects for me as a board member was sort of treading the fine balance between maintaining collaborative relationships while holding the institution to account and pushing for the best policies from our perspective. You know, it meant standing your ground on clear principles, but doing so in a constructive and solution-focused way. It also crucially often meant not standing alone, but by, you know, forming allies across the board in order to get through what you wanted. And that sort of really also changed the whole nature of like the way that you operate. So it's important to note that seldom did sort of standing of ground ever, you know, when we did do that, that it often didn't make it to the board table. And I think people often don't see that. I don't see the sort of like drawing a line in the sand, because that often happens outside of the board table, in the corridors where you're sort of trying to forge consensus or compromise, or sort of like saying, well, we're not going to budge on this. So, you know, when others realize that, they'll say, okay, all right, let's see what conclusion that we can come up to. I feel like I've been talking too long, but I just wanted to end by saying, you know, I'm really under no doubt that by being at the table with a vote, you know, I was able to affect massive change for, you know, the poorest and most marginalized that I would, you know, never have been able to do from the outside. I'll stop there.
Thanks. Well, with that in mind, maybe let's come back to the fact that it is World Health Assembly Week, at least in some nominal way. So I just wanted to hear from those who do engage more with the World Health Assembly, what it was like with this virtual meeting. Was there space for civil society? Were you able to engage? What happened the past couple of days?
Well, news are mixed as usually. Don't expect me to be too enthusiastic. There was some successful civil society engagement in the negotiations of the resolutions which was adopted today at the World Health Assembly. With organizations, mainly those working in the field of access to medicines, being the well-organized lobby and strong lobby as we know them, influencing also the drafting of the text, but also some other civil society colleagues promoting particular language in the resolution, for example, on palliative care, or well, doing a good job. And all this, despite the fact that all this took place behind the closed doors of a member states-driven process. I also liked those negotiations of the last 2 weeks as a strong expression of interest in the WHO by the member states, as we have seen many heads of states speaking at the World Health Assembly yesterday and today. But just to be aware, what you saw yesterday and today, this is just a show at the end of a very long process, which normally goes all around a year. And we have many moments and places to intervene. The most important is every year the executive board meeting in January, when we have the proposals already on the table where we can speak, where we can intervene, and where we know what are the positions of the member states. And when afterwards, this allows us to engage in advocacy between January and May in view also of shaping the positions and the texts for a World Health Assembly. But this World Health Assembly was really special. Special times for World Health Assembly with one topic, and this was COVID. And so we were quite happy that it already took place. We were not allowed to speak, as Mike told us, said. We were allowed to submit written statements. I just counted, and I think 83 organizations, 83 civil society organizations submitted written statements. You can still access them on the website of the WHO. And as part of the documentation. And some of these statements, they are here civil society provides sound technical input on a variety of issues, and also showing this very diversity of civil society dealing with WHO. You have all topics, you have all kinds of organizations. You will never bring them to speaking with one voice. And some also use this opportunity to promote their particular cause or their particular institution. So, as we did, when we called member states to care for their people and to respond to COVID, not against their populations, but together with the people and the civil society and the communities in their countries, and also urge them to engage again in multilateralism, in negotiated solutions, in binding regulations, and not in this ad hoc way of dealing with global health, as we have seen also in the COVID pandemic. And at the end of our statement, we stated that we will get back to the WHO with our request of being better recognized also in the governance structure of WHO in better times, when this urgency is over. And if we look at those better times ahead, I think we have made our points. You can read them also in our statements, also on the website of the Geneva Global Health Hub. I think we have 3 main points. I think we really need to take care of the WHO and also on this democratic multilateralism, and that it is not replaced by this multi-stakeholder blah blah, where everybody who is either has a lot of money or has political power, has something to say, and the others are excluded. We want to claim the civil society's institutional right to formally participate in the WHO governance, and not to replace this participation by a set of playgrounds they wanted to offer us, such as a World Health Forum. I think, I hope that the World Health Forum is one of the first victims of COVID-19, that this proposal is not there anymore. And The most important is that we request the WHO Secretariat and the member states to reflect on what needs to be done upstream, beyond the governing body meetings, where at the national level, also this space of civil society needs to be shaped and protected so that afterwards civil society is also in the positions of the member states when they come to Geneva for a World Health Assembly. This is all a lot of work still to be done. But today, I think in the COVID crisis, we really, and I hope that we can continue the conversation a bit at that level, focus on what we heard as stories from those people working at the national level, how they struggle with being harassed and being kind of a victim of an authoritarian state that leads the COVID response without caring for their people.
Right. I think that's really important. I want to come back to that when we start thinking about the next steps in terms of COVID governance, and ask Dr. Mercy and Nadezhda to address that. But first, I just wanted to see if Gargeya, if you wanted to share anything in terms of WHA and your experience of that this time.
So, just to tell that, so People's Health Movement every year follows the World Health Organization's EB, WHO, and many more meeting. We physically follow these both, go there, make statements on behalf of MMI. In fact, so everything I run through Thomas, who's here. So apart from that, something that was missing in this World Health Assembly is there is not a single word about lockdowns. It's been so difficult. So we are in countries where the number of people who are dying because they don't get essential health services, which are usually open, who are having issues due to hunger, malnutrition, the number of other deaths that are happening, and the amount of how violent this has been in some ways, or if not violent. So this all has been totally missing from WHO. It kind of is a very sanitized one where definitely the access to medicines is one of the most important one, because we have seen how patents and have created such barriers. For example, a single mask, when it has 400 patents on it, and the health workers in India are unable to get the mask because there are so many patents and we can't manufacture. Those are absolutely important points. And we are glad there is a lot of access to medicines team there. But some things which are disappointing, nowhere do we see in the resolution that got passed that the treatment and the testing should be free. We don't see anything about lockdowns. And something at the end of the day is about unilateral embargoes. It's a bit disheartening that end of the day, a country like Cuba in such a pandemic does send hundreds of health workers to other countries to help, but it faces embargo and unilateral sanctions. So, you see this, and the civil society space, we can, irrespective of being allowed in the WHO or not, we can make a lot of noise, and our power is actually in bringing people together. Protesting otherwise, or in this time it has been mostly, we are very bad on Twitter, but we have started using it a bit better. So yeah.
Well, that's good.
So
yeah, Gargeya, I'm so glad that you raised that, because I have to say now I'm stepping out of the neutral moderator shoes to be a human rights activist, but I was so disappointed by how long it took for WHO to start addressing the human rights issues that contributed to both the outbreak and the response. In particular, the suppression of whistleblowers and civil society groups in China, including volunteer groups that were spontaneously mobilizing to try to help people in Wuhan and that were shut down. And I think that that's something rare when you have a strong civil society presence in the governance. As we've seen with UNAIDS and the Global Fund, it is possible sometimes to push through funding and action to address human rights in ways that support colleagues who are working within countries to try to open things up in their countries. So. But I think with that, maybe we should start thinking about COVID-19 more specifically, and what is the role of journalism and of civil society going to be in ensuring accountability, especially considering the restrictions. And I wanted to come back to you, Dr. Mercy, since we started with you, to just kind of reflect on what you think the future holds.
I think for me, COVID-19 has presented us, both media and civil society, a chance to make a lot of changes, an opportunity to bring to the fore the many issues in the health sector that civil society has seen, media has seen. And now here, being a medical doctor, being a medical journalist, I've seen what is happening on both sides. And there's an African saying that when you climb the Iroko tree, you come down with as much firewood as possible. COVID-19 has presented a situation where health is at the forefront. So for me, I see the situation is that civil society and media needs to work hand in hand for a lot of things to happen, because the health systems in any country should be prepared for a situation like this. Health systems that can handle a pandemic, not maybe 100%, but to a better extent, is the health systems that we're looking for. So civil society, media, one, need to work together hand in hand to make sure that all the changes that are needed to strengthen the health systems, particularly in the developing world, like we see in Africa, in some parts of Asia, in some parts of South America, this is the chance then to make sure that all those plans that are being put in place to respond to COVID become plans that will outlive COVID, to respond to the health system, because this may not be the last pandemic that we're seeing, many more might come. So it's a chance for civil society and media to work together. And media here needs to give civil society space. We have print space, we have airtime, we have airtime on radio. This is the opportunity then for media to allow civil society to come in and speak to some of these issues, because some of the health challenges are not new. They've always been there. And since right now everyone is listening, then it's the time that media gives civil society that space to do that, exactly that. Bring out all the other issues that have always been there, give a way forward, give solutions, because again, we do not want to just talk about all the problems. We need to be solution-based. So offer solutions on what needs to be done moving forward. Now, the other thing is that media, and how I see myself, for example, at this particular point, needs to question a lot of the things that are happening, because just because government has said does not necessarily mean it's the right thing. So we need to question as much as possible. So we need journalists who are bold, who can stand up and know what to ask, the right things to ask, because only then can the public know that this should be the way things should be done, or government is not doing something right, or they're doing right. But we need people who know and who are bold enough to ask those questions. They need to challenge decisions where need be. They need to hold governments accountable. And this is, well, another example from Kenya, where one of the county governments in the country procured 600 20-liter jerry cans. So you can imagine any 20-liter jerry can that you can think of, for $100 each. The market price is actually like $1.50. But they procured it for $100, 600 of them. So we need to be able to sniff out all of those questions, all of those issues, so that we bring them to the fore, because at the end of the day, we are not resource rich. No country has enough resources. So we need to be able to pick out all of these things and put them out there, because at the end of the day, we need to hold our leaders accountable, because at the end of the day, we are the ones who stand to benefit. Now, the other parts of media, which is now with the lockdown, with restrictions of movement, we're seeing taking center stage is social media. And sometimes, even as mainstream journalists, you get your stories from social media, from Twitter, from Facebook, from Instagram. All of these social media spaces are becoming loud spaces for citizens, for civil society, for anyone to actually put content out there, so that when it is something important, when it is something worthwhile, then it is amplified by mainstream media. So I see a situation where citizen journalism takes center stage, mainstream media follows suit, and plus civil society, then we'll have stronger communities that are able to hold governments accountable, because all of us will be speaking with the same voice. With restrictions, with curfews, with physical distancing measures, obviously meetings, protests and whatnot are becoming a bit difficult. So we may need to rethink how civil society can agitate for issues. And for me, the easiest way I see that is now that we are all moving online, social media spaces, mainstream media spaces, then that is the space where we need to move our agitation. So in summary, working together, both from a citizen journalism perspective or from the community perspective, mainstream media and civil society then is the best way to, make sure that the COVID response becomes a bigger health response, because at the end of the day, we have UHC 2030, where we are looking at everyone having universal health coverage by 2030. COVID, for me, is that stepping stone, is that jolt, is that push that should accelerate us to move there. So we need those three to work together for us to achieve that in the shortest time possible.
That was very powerful. Thank you. And I think you're really speaking also to one of the questions, and I'm just looking at the dozens of questions that we're getting now from participants. One of them was about how civil society adapts to advocating in an online environment, given the government's suddenly become unavailable, unresponsive, right? How do you start to put pressure on and engage effectively, and having that additive value on social media seems like one good strategy, as well as the communication between journalists and civil society activists who can use that work. And noting that I actually found Dr. Mercy through Kaylin in Kenya, human rights NGO that put us in touch. I think that pretty much all our speakers want to come in on this point of how we're going to engage and ensure accountability to the COVID response, and then we'll turn to questions. So maybe Nadezhda, do you want to speak to how you're going to continue to do your work, and your grantees will do their work considering the restrictions in Bulgaria?
Sure, yeah. Just I want to say that I absolutely agree with everything Dr. Mercy said. And for me, civil society and media should work together to hold governments or agencies accountable. But as a representative of the civil society sector, I would say that for me, there are like three levels or three roles the civil society can play. And the first is played by activists or small grassroots organizations who do exactly this. They hold accountable the decision makers by online activism or artivism or protesting or doing communications campaign, and they keep the conversation as transparent as possible. So basically they raise awareness of all the sides and all the problems this conversation has. Then for me, the second level is for a bit bigger organizations, such as women's funds or big national organizations or even INGOs, who from the one side open the doors and make a space for the most vulnerable people or groups to be on the table. But also we do our advocacy work, we do our resource mobilization, we build coalition, and again, intersectional coalition, not human rights or health organizations, but just the civil society sector coming together to hold accountable the agencies. And then I would say there is a third very specific level, and that's philanthropy plays in the civil society sector. And it's big private foundations or just big funders in the civil society whose role is to support the first and the second level, provide core support or flexible funding for activists and for NGOs to do their work as transparent as possible, but also as independent as possible. Because we also come back to this question, are the big INGOs who sit at the table really independent and really critical? And for me, it's about funding in the end. When you're an NGO, it's always about the funding. And the more you're non-government reliant, the better work you will do when you want to hold somebody accountable. And also, I would say one very specific role for INGOs and for big funders is to make sure that this response is equally distributed and really no one is left behind. Women's rights and LGBT rights and migrant rights are all there, put at the table and questioned how this COVID response will benefit those groups who are the most vulnerable after all.
Absolutely, and you know, it just reminds me of Patrick Aba, who was one of the speakers on our first event in this series last Thursday, made the point that we're only as strong as our weakest link, right? And that's, you know, it's something we say a lot, but it's especially true with this pandemic. If we don't reach everybody, then we fail, and it's disastrous for everyone. So thank you. Mike, I think you wanted to address this, and I see we're getting a question about CSO engagement in the ACT Accelerator governance. So is that something that you can speak to? Excellent.
Yes,
and you have to explain what that is first before you
that was
address it.
exactly what I wanted to comment on. I mean, just building on the theme that I've been talking to, really, and you know, obviously, I think you know, involvement of civil society at national level is really where it's where it's critical in all the ways that have been described. And you know, we've been sort of engaging with the UK government through Action for Global Health and sort of trying to coordinate and influence their priorities and strategies in terms of their international work. And yeah, it's not easy. But yeah, what I wanted to sort of particularly talk about was the issue of civil society representation at the global level, in particular in relation to the COVID ACT Tools Accelerator, which is basically the key platform for moving forward for ensuring equitable access globally to COVID-19 technologies. And there are three sort of pillars with a sort of facilitation body. At the moment, it is basically a few governments, few big multilateral agencies and initiatives, and stakeholders like Gates and Wellcome Trusts. So, and civil society doesn't have a role and a space either in the facilitation group or in each of the distinct pillars, either on the vaccine, on the therapeutics, or on diagnostics. That is a massive problem, because unless civil society is meaningfully involved and fully supported in the governance at, you know, that facilitation group level and in each of the pillars, then we are not going to ensure equitable access. You know, all of those actors, you know, do a good talk about how important it is. But we know, for example, in chatting to the UK government, that what they're saying is, yeah, we've got this real challenge. What we're trying to do is balance the interests of the rich countries who are paying for the vaccine with, you know, the need for, you know, getting it round to and making sure that the vaccine gets to low and middle income countries. I mean, that whole conception and sort of this trying to get this balance is totally crazy. And of course, we have the UK also saying, well, you know, if we're the ones who develop the vaccine, we might want UK people to get it first. If everyone approaches it that way, then we are doomed. So we absolutely we know we've got some supporters already in that global coordination in terms of the Global Fund and UNITAID, who are actively promoting civil society involvement. The big question is sort of whether they will, but also how and who. So in terms of sort of the how they should be involved, you know, as we've talked about in terms of, you know, looking at typology so that you really have representation from low and middle income countries, from communities who might be affected, and from perhaps northern civil society also. That could be one way, but you definitely need to think that you've got all the representatives there. The other thing is sort of which organizations in particular, and we need to be really careful because there are a number of civil society organizations who may well have a conflict of interest, for example, receiving, pharma industry funding. So we need to be very clear and transparent about who is representing, as well as having clear mechanisms of representation, so that individual organizations who may be part of that governance aren't just representing their own organization's interests, that they are accountable, and that they need to get inputs from broader civil society. And of course, as I mentioned before, whoever is representing there needs to be supported to do so with resources and time. And it's not just, at that sort of that global, the coordination level, but also in terms of the different partnerships, we also need to keep an eye on CEPI, FIND, and the Therapeutics Accelerator, which are critical sort of partnerships within each of those three pillars I described. They also need to have an equitable access board, which should have civil society on it, so that we are at all levels ensuring that civil society voice is being heard, and ensuring that the vaccine and the different associated technologies sort of reached everyone who need them. Maybe I'll stop there.
Thanks very much, Mike. And, one of the things I worry about is, are we now going to create yet another international institution headquartered in Geneva, staffed by people from the global north, that has expensive meetings and expensive staff? Anyway, I just worry a little bit about that. But Gargaya, I saw that you wanted to jump in here, so we'll pass it to you.
So when we saw the ACT Accelerator, I think I can just give you a suggestion for your next webinar. The number of things that are happening outside WHO in these multi-stakeholder platforms, you might want to put a new webinar saying closing space of WHO in these numerous, platforms. Like, I mean, these all were actually, these are supposed to be in the United Nations system. Now they go outside, then we will feel bad that, oh, they are outside and all that. But look at it, WHO, apart from doing very meager or secretarial work in the ACT Accelerator, we don't see much. And, it would have been great if WHO was in it. And so here also we risk the problem that when the WHO also goes and sits on all these, it also legitimizes these initiatives, which many of us are not very comfortable with. Looking at, you get a vibe out of whatever you read that things don't seem to be going in the right place. That is one. So this is about the Geneva thing. I'll just jump into the COVID one because I think we're losing time and also the viewers are dropping. So one thing is also at the country level, what we see is that there is a capture of the policy space in some ways. And it is quite important to look at the role of consultancy firms. For example, the same consultancy firms, which not even 2 months, I think 2-3 months back, were giving the government of India, I don't remember, it's McKinsey or EY, Ernst & Young. One of them was giving that, you privatize all your hospitals. In India, you should run all the hospitals in PPP model and so on. And it's the same group of people who are actually now helping the government of India run its health services. So you have seen that the weakening of our health system has happened. Rampant privatization has happened. And the same groups which have been part of that are now sitting and driving the COVID response. And, there is no, I think this somebody somewhere down the lane, just like what we looked at the issues around Ebola, about the influence of BCG, Boston Consulting Group. Similarly, I think we will unearth more in the coming months about what these consultancy firms are up to. And the other thing is this, you go as a trade union person or as a small NGO person or something to the ministry, they are not going to actually even talk to you. You don't, there is the whole class issue there. You're not as well groomed itself. I'll just give you an example. So I used to work in the government before this, and a few union people came saying that our salaries did not come. We work in the AIDS department. So the officer, instead of listening to them, asked, do you have the right to actually form the union and association? But the next day, we actually had one of these top 4 consultancy firms come. We will make them sit and just listen to them as if, they're gods coming from somewhere. So there is this huge issue with, how we need to go into how BMGF and all the consultancy firms have taken over the policy space. We don't, nobody consults us, not just in India, in multiple countries. So these are issues that we might actually, after a few months, dig into and get, but most of them being non-transparent anyway, we won't get the exact details of this. And see, all the COVID response, we see that they're also not rooted in reality. It's like you need to impose a lockdown and the cases will reduce. No, it doesn't exactly happen. The reality in different countries is different. So you don't see that, because this top-down structure and the way these international agencies work, that's kind of coming to the fore. So I just thought with what's happening in Geneva and also in Delhi. So I just thought I'll come in there.
I'm so glad you raised that point about the consultancies, because that article came out, I think, like November or so, about how all these huge consulting firms were exercising outside power in global health governance. It's definitely a massive issue, and I think it really points to how little actually media scrutiny global health agencies get. There's very few journalists who are stationed in Geneva who are really, familiar with and looking deep into the kind of what's hidden in global health governance. I see we've got about 20 minutes left, and I just want to make sure we address some of these fantastic questions that are coming in, and please keep sharing them. If we don't get to all the questions, which I'm pretty certain we will not, by 1:30, what we'll do is we'll share it with the panelists, and then maybe some of them can respond on Twitter, which is something we did last time. But I wanted to have the first question go to Thomas as our resident WHA geek, if I could, to answer this question about the silence procedure, which has just been adopted by WHA. Well, maybe not just adopted, but it says it limits sharing proposals to member states who have the right to object. Proposals are selected by the President of the Assembly after consultation on or after recommendation by the Executive Board. It seems much will happen behind closed doors. Is this something that you can speak to, Thomas?
No, not too much. Silence procedure is something which is UN standard, and it has not been applied so much in the governing structure of WHO. I think the particular story here was just this virtual setup of the World Health Assembly. Normally, this kind of negotiating resolutions until the very bitter end happens behind closed doors of a real room in real Geneva, with night sessions ending at 4 o'clock in the morning, everybody totally exhausted, and then either failing to get consensus or achieving this consensus. So this was just not possible this time, because this resolution process just had to be finished before the beginning of the World Health Assembly. So this is something new. I just wanted to put a point also on the accountability story we had discussed before. I think there are some valid points which we have to take forward, also linking the global with the national. There was this assault on WHO and Tedros by the United States and its president. When the story got a bit more civilized again, the consensus was that we have to go for an independent evaluation of how the WHO responded to the pandemic. And I think this is standard, and this would have happened anyhow. And this is also put again into the resolution which is adopted today. The blind spot of this resolution is that the same independent evaluation, or let's say the same in-depth look at the response, needs to be done at the national level. This is a democratic obligation of every country who is accountable to its people. They have to report on how they did it, and they have to support this reporting by an independent evaluation. Hopefully not done by one of those fancy consulting firms, but in a process where also civil society is involved and engaged and has a say, and which is set up according to best standards for how to do such evaluations. And this is, I work for an organization. We are happy to have no money and no capacities. So we are just struggling with the basics. So if there is some big international NGO or consortium or alliance or etc. hearing this and investing a little bit of money and push for an international campaign for such independent evaluations. Please go ahead, don't wait. Just do it.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Mercy wanted to come in on this point, I think.
Yeah, I'm looking at it from COVID. The pandemic has made every nation look at themselves, start thinking of themselves from a country-based, nationalistic-based, and so everyone has been doing their own things depending on their situation, on their circumstances. So on this point, what I've seen, especially in this part of the world, in Africa, is that we've gotten into a pandemic in a situation where we hardly trust our governments. When the government tells you something, you have to go and verify and just confirm that they're not pulling your leg, or they're being truthful. So with the pandemic and the responses, the measures that have been put in place to try and contain the spread and the transmission of the virus, there's been a lot of things that have gone wrong, a lot of things that have gone right. And I think at the end of this, just like what Thomas has said, we will need absolute transparency from the different governments, because now everyone has been looking at their countries individually. We'll need transparency from government so that civil society, media, and even the government itself can do a proper audit, a post-mortem on how they responded to the COVID pandemic. And this, at the end of the day, now should be documents that can be shared by different countries so that countries can be able to see what was done right and worked, what didn't work, so that at the end of the day, because we are preparing also for future pandemics, which we do not know when they will come, we will know what worked and what didn't work. So it should not just be that the WHO does a retrospection and tries to look at what went wrong, what went right, but it should be every single government. And here now is where the people here, civil society, media, needs now to play a most important role, because some of these things, I'm sure people will try and hide a bit of things here and there because they don't want to be told that they didn't respond well and therefore they caused a lot of deaths and things like that. We need to look at all of these things with a hawk eye, so that for the sake of moving forward, we are able to learn from our mistakes and be able to avert mistakes that could have been prevented, so that we do not see the kind of problems that we are seeing currently.
Yes, I am so glad you said that about the hawk eye, because I think that is especially critical when we come to the data, which is one of my personal obsessions, which is the data that we don't get, the data that we don't see. And we had a very good question here about Belarus and Russia, about real statistics and data being hidden, the real situation in regards to safety of doctors being hidden or misreported. Another question about hidden epidemics in conflict settings. And we know that especially for the most marginalized populations, we often have this issue with people not being counted, not being reached. We saw this already in Singapore, which had this allegedly fantastic digital app, and then they missed 800 migrant workers in dormitories. So I just wondered if anyone could speak to how we address this and how civil society and the press can make sure that we are actually capturing some of that data. Mike, did you have your hand up there? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, this is obviously sort of a critical issue for all of us now, and I think there are in the virtual world sort of lots of different mechanisms sort of emerging for sort of real time trying to work out where the challenges are, what the problems are, but also what's working, and I think that's happening at a national level. And what we've been trying to do, and I know many others have also been trying to do this, is sort of like collecting those sort of that data, those case studies, in order to sort of both share those and triangulate and work out what the key priorities need to be, because this is, of course, in many ways, a brand new challenge that we're facing. We're drawing on the experience of lots of different epidemics that we've had, but this one has very particular aspects. This links to a point that I know you're familiar with very well, Meg, and is sort of been a very active discussion, and we as civil society have been really pushing and had strong support from UNAIDS, Global Fund and others around the issue of and investing in community-led monitoring. They're different from community-based monitoring because, of course, that could be done by anybody, including the government. Community-led monitoring is done by the community themselves, and they are monitoring for exactly those sort of list of things that I was talking about, whether services are available, whether they're quality, and whether there are barriers in place, etc. And these are critical mechanisms that just haven't been invested in meaningfully. And we've just finally now, the Global Fund and, as I said, UNAIDS have sort of really been pushing this and finally sort of investing in those mechanisms. But they need dramatically scaling up. And I think, you know, if we can do that, we need to do that immediately with COVID. And there are particular challenges there, because of course it needs to be largely virtual rather than sort of people necessarily going door to door. But yeah, there is a sort of a real growing body of both evidence that it works and momentum and advocacy around this being a critical sort of accountability mechanism that then linking to those representatives at the global, regional and national level and the governance table, then you create that virtuous cycle. So, but crucially, I think it is both the challenges, but also the successes. And I think Alan Maleche put a point in the question and answer just around that. We need to be focusing on what's working as well as not what's working.
Oh, but it's so much more fun to focus on things we can criticize, right? So thanks. I think I'm just going to try and squeeze in one last question, which is about mobilization. And so we had one question that came in by email about whether we could start thinking about, or maybe already exist, global and regional civil society bodies that support this kind of accountability work to also protect country-level civil society groups from targeting by the government. And then another question from Kene Isom at UNDP about how we could build broader intersectional human rights movements that break some of the old dichotomies. So I don't know if any of you are feeling especially visionary and want to go for this one, but how do we build and mobilize for the future? And I'm looking at Nadezhda because she was talking about like building broader movements. Not to put you on the spot though.
Yeah, it's a question that's bothering me a lot, how we build solidarity across movements. And I would say communications is the key. Communicating in a very successful, understandable and humane way our values as a civil society sector, and coming to the conclusion that in the end we all share those human values. And maybe I sound too optimistic, but maybe in time of crisis, people and movements come together to solve big issues or problems. But even in retrospection, there has been a lack of communication between the movements, even between generations of movements and NGOs representatives. So now I think with the tools that internet provides us with tools such as hope-based communications even, I think this is how we can mobilize people and how movements can come together. And also, just to mention, a very interesting research I read online, that the activists of the future will be just regular people with strong beliefs. It won't be professionalized activists. And yeah, in order maybe to speed up this process, for me, it's just telling all the compelling stories of fights and successes. So it's basically also data-driven, I guess, in a way, with the scarcity of data we have, but really turning the data into a collective narrative.
Beautiful. Thank you very much. Yes, Dr. Mercy.
I think for me, I'm a believer in working with the systems that are already there. As it is, I usually think we have so many bodies duplicating roles here and there when it comes to civil society space, even in the media spaces. So I'm a believer in strengthening the systems that are already there. If they can coalesce because they have a common purpose, they have a common goal, the better. Because already your systems are there, your contacts are there, your sources are there. So for me, I would think that this is the time that people with the same objectives, the same goals come together and work together, as opposed to creating more bodies than you have, so many things and you have to set up structures and whatnot. Then I would believe that we strengthen what we have and work with the ones that we have, because at the end of the day, we have a common goal, all of us. If it's to hold government accountable in the health space, then we are all looking there. If we want to have a marginalized and human rights addressed, then we already have bodies there. But if we all put our efforts and our resources together, then we are likely to have a better and bigger impact. So this would be the time to seize that opportunity and work together, because there's a common goal. The other one is to have more space for press freedom. Because a muzzled press then means that it's a muzzled society. If the press cannot do the stories that Nadejda is talking about, if they cannot highlight the positives, the negatives, things that need to be improved, then all this work, all this effort will be going to waste. So we need more space, better working environment for the media, better press freedom, and for civil society to work together when they have a common goal.
Thank you so much. That sounds like a great vision. I guess we're in wrap-up mode, so we might go a couple minutes over, but let's just let everyone have their last words. I think, Thomas, you had your hand up.
Yes, I think that civil society mobilization cannot be organized top-down. It's up to the people in every country to fight for their rights, and it's up to the democratic culture in every country and in the way people are organized to see if there is a space for civil society, for people to have their country engaged in those negotiations with the people or not. There might be some hopeless cases, and those cannot be repaired by any international campaign. And don't expect international NGOs doing the job for you. Beware of another NGOization of a struggle, which must be a struggle by social movements, by the people in the various ways they are organized. They know, you know, we know. I know it in Switzerland, and you know it in Kenya, and you know it in India.
Great, thank you. And as you say that, you're reminding me of some LGBTI activists in a country that I will not name just to distract us. That was legendary for targeting of LGBT peoples. What they did is they started protesting with labor activists and joining their marches in solidarity. And so when there was an attack on LGBT groups, then the labor groups then actually started supporting them as well. So it was kind of an interesting example. Gargea, did you want to comment on this point?
Yeah, just to the last words is also this whole pandemic kind of brought us to some realization. Just adding to the NGOization thing, that there is so much that NGOs, civil societies can do, but the actual power structure still is with the government, and it's equally important that the governments are held accountable, and that we equally need to talk about the political structures we are in. Mostly, when in this webinar, for example, authoritarian governments is one thing, but it's also market-oriented governments which still do believe in the, COVID kind of thrown open everything, right from local production to everything. So it kind of also shows our own limitation as NGOs and civil society, that, end of the day, politics is equally important, and we should not try to let this, let this pandemic go into the same thing that previous things have thrown us into in the form of NGOization. Politics is equally important, and let's follow that towards a progressive and non-market oriented and more egalitarian society, hopefully. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much. Is this better? I hear my microphone was not working very well. Okay, good. Mike, did you want to finish us up?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, what to add from the great comments already? I mean, just to say, I mean, you know, I think both we've got huge challenges obviously in front of us, but I think there are also sort of silver linings, and you know, as we know, discussions across the board in terms of building back better, and you know, what does that mean for us and our sector for global, for health? But then how do we connect and build a movement, you know, across health, but beyond health? You know, we've definitely, you know, been already before the COVID crisis, there were sort of a number of discussions around the need for a global funding mechanism that is specifically targeted for supporting national civil society health advocacy. It can only sort of cost a relatively small amount of money compared to sort of programmatic interventions, but it can have such a massive impact and does exactly supporting national actors to do exactly what Thomas was just describing, as sort of holding their governments to account and in the way that they need to in terms of their policies. You know, and sort of building that movement, I think sort of if there was that sort of fund, then, you know, there is a need for sort of greater connectivity between different networks at the national, regional and global level, and some more work I think needed, not to create a whole new structure necessarily, but to link together better with the existing networks of activists and civil society stakeholders sort of around the globe. It was sort of underpinned by the lack of inclusion in the Global Action Plan and of course all these sort of governance mechanisms we've mentioned. But just the last point, 2 points is, you know, we have to sort of link concretely with other actors in other sectors, you know, across the SDGs, but particularly there's opportunities with climate, with the upcoming COP26, and linking sort of on sort of global and planetary health, as well as with the economy, the recession that's going to follow the COVID crisis. We have to be linking very concretely with brand new ideas around how we can raise more money from new sources that can actually fund the health systems that we need. And we need a narrative that underpins that and that really brings people together, both responding and speaking to their local experience, but linking them in solidarity to people across the world. So yeah, no small task, but let's have a go.
Yeah, sounds like you've got a lot more Zoom calls in your future, all of you. Thank you so much for a very rich discussion. We covered a lot of ground and hopefully made a strong case for a strong role for the media and civil society in ensuring accountability as we move forward. So thank you again to Thomas Schwartz, Medicus Mundi International, Nadezhda Dirmanjieva from Bulgarian Fund for Women, Mike Podmore at STOPAIDS, Mercy Courier at KTN News, and Gargeya Telakapali at the People's Health Movement. Wonderful to speak with you all. There was a question about the slides, so we will have the video recording and the slides we'll post on the website. Might not be right away, but maybe in a few days. But thank you all. Thank you for support from the teams at STOPAIDS and Medicus Mundi International and the Global Health Center. And I'm just being directed to share my screen so that you can see our next events, which are going to be really exciting. We have a full week up ahead. So we have an event tomorrow, which will focus, sorry, here we are. Okay, so we'll have an event tomorrow, a very exciting one, discussing the political and commercial determinants of diabetes, discussing the film El Susto, The Shock, with saluteglobal.it, and events following that on access to medicines, gender equality, and health system strengthening to achieve universal health coverage. To get more updates, please join our mailing list or follow us on social media. Thank you so much, and goodbye.